Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and it's really good to see you all here today. Well, last week we discussed the final chapter of Shantideva's Way of the Bodhisattva, the way of the Bodhisattva, the way of those who aspire to awakening, an awakened mind, not only for their own benefit, but for the benefit of all beings, and not just human beings, but all beings. And Shantideva has gone through the various, basically, virtue practices that are part of the Bodhisattva path: generosity and morality, meditation, patience, energy or vigor, and wisdom. Wisdom being the pinnacle of virtues. And now, in the final chapter, Shantideva offers a dedication. Dedication being something that is often included in writings in order to offer respect or memory or appreciation, gratitude, or commitment to some person, place, or thing, or ideal. And this final chapter of Shantideva's Way of the Bodhisattva is a little bit of all of those. So we read several selections last week of the chapter, and I would like to read a couple more this week. Starting with this one. And may the blind receive their sight, and may the deaf begin to hear. And women near their time bring forth, like Maya Devi, Maya Devi being the Buddha's mother, free from all travail. And may the naked now be clothed, and all the hungry eat their fill. And may those parched with thirst receive pure waters and delicious drink. And may the poor and destitute find wealth, the haggard and the careworn joy. May those now in despair be whole in mind, endowed with sterling constancy. May every being ailing with disease be freed at once from every malady. May every sickness that afflicts the living be wholly and forever absent from the world. So those are various aspirations that Shantideva is stating. And they might sound like just a list of wishful thoughts. One might even say idle wishful thoughts, because having lived on the planet, one knows that those things are unlikely to happen, any of them. But I think they are expressed for a very definite reason. And if we go back to an earlier section of the way of the Bodhisattva, Shantideva talks along these lines. He says, bodhicitta, the aspiration to be a bodhisattva, to follow the Buddha way. Bodhicitta, the awakened mind, is known in brief to have two aspects. First, aspiring, that's bodhicitta with intention, and then active bodhicitta, practical engagement. As corresponding to the wish to go and then to setting out, the wise should understand respectively the difference that divides these two. From bodhicitta in intention, great results arise for those still turning in the wheel of life. Yet, merit does not rise from it in ceaseless streams, as is the case with active bodhicitta. So this aspiration is a necessary condition for engagement. The desire is a necessary condition for the doing, but it's in the doing that there is ceaseless streams of merit, as he's talking about. So in this recitation of aspirations, in the section that I read, it establishes a direction for engagement, and it mentions various forms of suffering that are present in the world and that we're all familiar with, either by firsthand experience or through witnessing others. So by having the aspiration to move in this direction, it establishes a direction for us to become engaged. And in whatever manner, to become enlisted in the followers of the Buddha who are attempting to relieve suffering of the various sorts. Now, when one talks about followers of the Buddha, one could potentially bring to mind something more or less militaristic, where everyone's wearing the same uniform, having the same thoughts, and marching in file. But this is very much not a part of the Mahayana tradition. It is recognized that everyone is unique and that you don't have to even try to be unique. You are unique whether you want it or not. And that there are thousands of ways of being a follower of the Buddha. And that there are thousands of ways of being a bodhisattva. And that Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, has 1,000 arms. So we all can express the Bodhisattva way uniquely. The next section of the dedication chapter that I would like to read is near the end. And now, as long as space endures, as long as there are beings to be found, may I continue likewise to remain to drive away the sorrows of the world. The pains and sorrows of all wandering beings, may they ripen wholly on myself, and may the virtuous company of bodhisattvas always bring about the happiness of beings. So once again, in this section, Shantideva is stating an aspiration for himself, but also inviting us to share in the aspiration, to remain, to drive away the sorrows of the world. Pointing back to the Buddha's essential mission from the very first teaching of the Buddha, when he spoke with the 5 ascetics who had been his companions during his 6 years of travail in seeking enlightenment, all the way to the end of his life teaching at the age of 80. His primary focus, almost his solitary focus, was understanding human suffering and the relief of human suffering. Shantideva is expressing willingness to engage in that activity, trying to understand suffering and to relieve it in oneself as well as others, in all beings. It implies several things, many things, that the Buddha addressed throughout his life of teaching. But one of them was not turning away from the evident suffering in the world. Not, in a sense, denying it. And also, to what extent one can, given one's limitations, try to address that suffering in any way possible. That one stanza that I read, and now as long as space endures, as long as there are beings to be found, may I continue likewise to remain, to drive away the sorrows of the world, is likely the most quoted passage from The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva. And it's often recited in liturgical ceremonies and various traditions. Shantideva closes with this passage. And now to Manjughosha I prostrate. And now to Manjughosha I prostrate, whose kindness is the wellspring of my good intent, and to my virtuous friends I also bow. whose inspiration gave me strength to grow. And now to Manjughosha I prostrate, I bow, whose kindness is the wellspring of my good intent, and to my virtuous friends I also bow, whose inspiration gave me strength to grow. Manjughosha is another name for Manjushri, who is the mythical bodhisattva of wisdom, the personification of wisdom, the image associated with wisdom, and is depicted in various ways. This is an image from a statue that is in Japan. It's dated back to the 18th century, and it's labeled there Manjo, which is another name for Manjushri. Sorry. Actually, I guess it's in the British Museum. It's from Japan. Many of these Asian treasures ended up in the British Museum. That's another story. So, um, so what about this mythical figure to which Shantideva is prostrating himself? Well, what is bowing or prostrating? It's in Asian culture showing respect, showing appreciation or gratitude, showing a certain reverence. And showing respect to a mythical figure may seem strange to some. What is the place of these mythical figures in our practice? Well, for some individuals, they may be ill-disposed to make any place for them. But I would suggest they can serve a function. These mythical figures are products of the imagination. They're personifications of virtue. They bring to mind intentions. They bring to mind a whole body of literature and a whole range of practice all at once. They speak to the brain, but also to the heart in a way that a concept cannot. So bringing to mind Manjushri, for instance, who might carry a sword to cut delusions, and in this image that I just showed you, carries a sword and a scepter, signifying the teachings. And in an instant, bring to mind and to heart an intention or an aspiration, a direction for us to follow. So does it make any difference what mythical figure we choose? Could we just as well choose Smokey the Bear or Tinkerbell? Well, I think those mythical figures also serve a purpose. Smokey the Bear is very effective. I think all of you will recall the public service announcements, the PSAs about Smokey the Bear, and only you can prevent forest fires. That image of Smokey the Bear speaks to the mind. It reminds us of that little saying, but it also speaks to the heart, because that image of the bear reminds us that there are other mammals out there who also have a heart, who depend on us to be careful with what we're doing, that depend on us to make sure that the campfire is no longer smoldering when we leave it, that it's fully doused. That depend on us to not set off fireworks in a forest. So these mythical bodhisattvas, Manjushri and Avalokiteshvara, which we'll be talking about more perhaps next week, serve a function, and they have a long history. And that helps give them strength in our mind. So if we are disposed to use our imagination in that way, we can bring Manjushri to mind at any time. This may seem a little bit off the track, but in a sense, we're all mythical figures, at least according to Buddha's teaching of no self, anatta. There is no fixed, separate self that you can identify. Just a flow of various streams of form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness, which come together by way of causes and conditions that are constantly changing. And the self we make up is made up of fragments of selective memory that are woven into a story that we identify as the self. And the same is true for others as well. In a sense, we're all mythical figures. But the difference between us and Manjushri and Avalokiteshvara is that because we're associated with a body, we suffer. And the suffering is the project that the Buddha addressed. So it's interesting that at the end of this work on the way of the Bodhisattva, with the pinnacle virtue being wisdom, that Manjushri is addressed, but he is addressed in this way. And now to Manjughosha, I prostrate, whose kindness is the wellspring of my good intent, whose kindness is the wellspring of my good intent. So it's the kindness or the compassion of Manjushri that is being addressed here, as if that is an essential feature of wisdom. And in the next topic we'll be discussing, which will be the Heart Sutra, it's of interest because it is about wisdom, but the spokesperson for the sutra is Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. So I think I'll stop there, and And I guess in the breakout rooms, we can talk about whatever we like, of course, but we can think about this association between aspiration and engagement. What does it mean? How do we do these things? How do we put them in practice? What various manifestations of the Bodhisattva way are out there available for us? And the notion of these mythical figures that populate Mahayana literature. How do we relate to them? Are they helpful, useful to us? So thank you for listening today. I appreciate your being here, and we'll get back together in a few moments.